McCarthy. First of all, what is your take on McCarthy as a politician, as a human, as a now Speaker of the House?
He's an old school, classic, conventional politician of the modern type. So he's one of these people that probably was, doing Model UN in high school, those kind of people. These are people that really live for internal politics and love the designation of Speaker of the House. They love the title, the nomenclature. Joe Biden is representative of this group of people. It's the rise of the professionalization of politics in America. And it, in my view, has been a very negative factor in American political life, that we have people who do nothing from the time they're teenagers, but run for office and seek office. We have lawyers, doctors, a bunch of credentialed people who have limited life experience, who are not the best suited people, in my view, to represent people in government. And what we have fewer of is small business people. What we have fewer of is independent entrepreneurs. What we have fewer of is creative types. What we have fewer of is just ordinary, everyday people. Now, we've never had tons of those in government. It's one of the weaknesses of representative government, in my view, is that it dilutes the impact of democracy when you have this interference with someone representing you. And there's just a long, notorious history of people not actually keeping their promises. There's a reason why politicians are as hated as anybody, up there with lawyers and others as professions go. And McCarthy's your classic guy. I mean, even look at his hairdo. Everything about the guy screams professional politician. I can't wait to be named chairman of the Model UN. So there's nothing about him that's trustworthy. Nothing about him that's reliable. I don't see him as a dark figure. He's not the power freak that McConnell is. He's not the nasty war whore that people like Dan Crenshaw, One-Eyed McCain, and some of these other guys are.
It's Eye Patch McCain. He said it today on Twitter, or he said it in an interview. Eye Patch McCain. I say that the most insulting thing about that is.
Did I say One-Eyed McCain?
You said One-Eyed McCain.
Because I think of the One-Eyed Ogre. That's why I think of One-Eyed Ogre, and so that's why I think of him as One-Eyed McCain.
Making fun of the eye patch is juvenile. It's what he looks like. He can't help it. I think the truly insulting thing to him, and I'm not talking about you, Robert. I mean, in general, people call him the eye patch McCain. The insulting thing is being compared to McCain. And I think that's actually what insults
the eye patch thing. I mean, the eye patch thing gave him his panache, gave him his initial entrevue as this sort of popular figure when Saturday Night Live, made fun of it in sort of inappropriate ways. It's the McCain part. That's why I call him the one eye thing. And the reason why is because he sees the world with one eye. In other words, like the old Homer sort of image, right? The one-eyed giant, or the great film, Oh Brother Art Thou, which is really just a remade version of Homer's Great Odyssey, is that the one-eyed person doesn't see the world fully. And is an ogre of a type. You think of that one big eye in the middle. That when I see Crenshaw, that's who I see. And I don't think McCarthy is like that. He's a weak-kneed, classic, conventional politician, utterly untrustworthy. Won't challenge institutional power for anything. Will capitulate at the moment, at the drop of a hat. Is longtime best buddies with Paul Ryan. Is roommates with Frank Luntz. These are not people you really want to be associating with if you care about ordinary people, populist values, the little d democratic values, old school conservative values. If you're on that side of the aisle, McCarthy is exactly what you don't like. So but McCarthy was more simple in all of this. The issue was the institutional rot that is the House of Representatives of the United States Congress. And it's an institutional rot that has been enabled and facilitated by rule changes over the past several decades. Now, in truth, the House has been crap for most of its history. That's the God's honest truth. And people are like, there was almost a fight on the floor between Mike Rogers and Matt Gaetz. There have been actual fights on the House floor. People have shot each other on the House floor. People have stabbed each other on the House floor. They used to really brawl on the House floor. So that didn't concern me much. What did concern me is that these rules are atrophying democracy and making ordinary people increasingly believe the United States government is unrepresentative of their interest. And that's what this rebellion was about. And it's a rebellion that had been building for decades, frankly. When Gingrich took over in 94, he made a bunch of reform changes that were good. And then they went back on him in the early 2000s under W. And the Democrats never liked them. And so they scrapped him. And these are reforms that just enabled democracy to actually mean something. That your representative be able to, for example, propose an amendment on the floor. That you actually have a bill as a single bill, not 6 things thrown into one.
Let me stop you there. When did that become a custom? That what do they call the pig fat or the pork? What, like,
they've been doing it sporadically over the decades, but it accelerated under under W and then under Pelosi, and then it was continued by the Republicans. I mean, Dennis Hastert, for crying out loud, the Speaker of the House for the Republicans, was a pedo. I mean, that's who they're, I mean, this is not something you should be proud of. So these were the kind of leaders, so-called leaders, that were being representative. And then Pelosi after him, and then the various nitwits and losers after on the Republican side, and then back to Pelosi. And so the McCarthy is seen as a weak guy. He's not seen as someone anybody really respects. He's seen as a tool. And the issue was, let's use him and his speakership vote to finally at least create some sort of reform. Probably the most eloquent expression of this was by Chip Roy. I worked with Chip Roy during maybe Chip doesn't want to talk about it, but I worked with him in some different contexts in which he was very sincere and fought very well. I'll put it that way. Might have been in Georgia in 2020. I'll let you put those connections together. But I like Chip. Don't always agree with him, but I respect him. Very independent guy, a guy who does sincerely care about the institution working, and working in a little d democratic way, working in ways that's representative of the people's interest and is reflective of their constitutional obligations. And to their credit, to Matt Gaetz's tremendous credit, Lauren Boebert, others, the Chip Roy, some young congressmen from Arizona, some others, they were able to do something that hadn't been done in a century, which was force 15 votes. And what was the consequence of that? Certain assurances of at least some form of reform. Now, the concern is that once McCarthy became Speaker, that the establishment-oriented House Republicans would then break McCarthy's promise and not go through with the rules reforms. I think that would be a massive, massive mistake by those moderate Republicans, because they'll earn a certain enmity that will lead to major institutional issues going forward in the House. Because while people think that the House vote was a means to force these reforms, it is by no means the only means. There are ways in which people can create all kinds of havoc if McCarthy doesn't keep his word. So I understand the concerns of Richard Barris and others who are like, look, these people have no history of being reliable. They're probably, as soon as you let McCarthy in, they're just going to walk it back and turn around on Monday and not vote through the rules package. That may happen, and I understand where that concern is. I think, though, the institutional leaders, after what they just went through, understand what kind of risk that poses. And I don't think they will. I think you will see them actually go through with the committee promises and the rules changes. What do those rules changes mean? Big rules changes. It means, 3 members of the Freedom Caucus are on the Rules Committee. What does that mean? That means that a whole bunch of stuff, they have veto power over what gets to the floor. The ability to propose legislation yourself directly. The ability to propose amendments directly. I mean, these are real reforms that truly little d democratize the process. What had happened is the House had trophied so bad that a small group of elite people in the Congress could unilaterally decide what legislation was even debated, least of all passed. That, under these reform changes, these are the most dramatic reform changes since Gingrich came in 1994, and arguably the most dramatic reform changes in the history of the House. And I think that if McCarthy keeps his word and the establishment Republicans don't try to blow up the party all over again, then these reforms will make a real difference in the House of Representatives in the upcoming term. What I'm most excited about, no legislation is going to go through, but the ability to propose legislation, to put policy ideas before the court of public opinion. By the way, some of these reforms that passed, I was working with Ralph Nader to try to get done in the 90s. This is how long this has been burgeoning, right? The ability to just propose legislation yourself as an individual member of the House, the ability to propose amendments on the floor. This should have all been easy and simple. They had gutted all of it. They had stacked the Rules Committee, so only establishment proposals ever even got debated or discussed. Committees that didn't investigate anything except what the establishment wanted. It would be the biggest thing that I'm looking forward to in the immediate future is what Congressman Thomas Massie said. And it would be humiliating to Kevin McCarthy. It would be humiliating to the Republican Party if they don't do what Thomas Massie said they had agreed to do when it's already published now on Tucker Carlson for the world to see.
And what Massie said were the 10 points or the concessions made so that McCarthy gets the speakership.
The big one is what I've been calling for a half decade is a church committee. That is what's needed. Like some people said, oh, ignore all this. It doesn't matter. You can't pass the legislation. I get that. Recognize in advance, Democrats control the Senate. Democrats control the White House. You're not getting any legislation through. That ain't happening. What you can do is you can block some bad legislation. Number one. Number two, what you can also do is propose ideas that become the ground of a platform moving forward. So people know what the heck is it we're voting for when we vote Republican, because many people still don't know. In the working class North, many of them that stayed home and didn't vote or voted Democrat this past time are like, how am I supposed to trust the Mitch McConnells of the world? So that's the utility of being able to have a diverse range of legislative proposals put forward, is see which ideas catch fire and become part of the platform for 2024. But most importantly, from my point of view, is a new church committee. You put Thomas Massie, you put other people like that on that committee. You let that committee, you put Matt Gaetz on that committee. You put some of those folks on that committee. We put Marjorie Taylor Greene on that committee, and McCarthy owes her tremendously after people have been critical of her. She made a very tactical decision. She was going to align with McCarthy to increase her position of power and influence in the House when they've been trying to drive her out, remove her from committees, exclude her from positions of influence, etc. She made a tactically smart decision that was savvy for the agenda she supports, and it's a very populist agenda she supports. So I have no problem whatsoever with how she approached it. I think it was tactically the very wise decision. Just as I have no problem with Matt Gaetz. I'm a big fan of Matt Gaetz, and he proved his utility once again. In how he managed this. He managed this extraordinarily well. But I'm really looking, people should not underestimate the power of an investigative committee. The church committee is the only reason we know about MK Ultra. The church committee is the only reason we know about the assassinations. The church committee is the only reason we know about a lot of things we know currently about the Kennedy and the King assassinations, both Kennedy assassinations and the King assassination. So while those committees could have been a lot more robust, they could have been a lot more detailed, they could have been a lot better, they were still the most. Find another nation in the world that didn't just collapse and fall apart, where they did a meaningful introspection of their most powerful deep state apparatus within the government, right? I mean, did the Soviet Union ever do that? I mean, they did one speech after Stalin by Khrushchev that was in secret. That was about it, right? I mean, that was extraordinary what we did. We exposed our own CIA, our own NSA, our own Pentagon, our own military, our own White House, our own FBI. That was extraordinary. And it was a great period of transparency. It provided and the only way you're going to get reform is for more people to know. So have more of these hearings. Look at what the Twitter files have done. Imagine the Twitter files times 10 on steroids. That's what this church committee can be. So I'm very optimistic about how all this progressed. Credit to all those conservatives who, with the conscience to hold up. Credit to Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's playing it a different way for her own reasons, but I think will ultimately be beneficial also to the populist cause. You need people on both sides and tactically when you're maneuvering in this way. And they outmaneuvered McCarthy and the establishment tremendously. The establishment is enraged. Sean Hannity was crying. He had to put on his CIA pin and put on his Pentagon pin, figure out which deep state he was going to whore for today. And he was whining and complaining. It didn't matter. Mark Levin, another fake populist, was whining and complaining. His opinion doesn't matter. Mark Levin disappeared tomorrow. Nobody would care. That's the reality. He's like Bill O'Reilly. Nobody cared. Nobody ever cared. That's what Donald Trump figured out when he went on tour with him. Nobody cares about Bill O'Reilly. Nobody ever did care about Bill O'Reilly. He was a Fox News creation. He was not himself interesting, except for when he blew up when he was at Access Hollywood. You know, him screaming is the only thing that's memeable about him. That and his illicit sex tapes with workers. So the little phone calls. So people were always useless, and they got exposed again as useless because these folks didn't bend. There's been some criticism of Trump, understandably. Trump was playing it his way, and he played it to his advantage. And we'll see whether it works ultimately to his advantage. Monday will be the determinative vote. If these promises are all broken, Republicans are in serious trouble. The Republican establishment is in serious trouble. If they keep their word, then this is going to be a very promising House session for 2023 and 2024.
Quick question. A church committee has no specific object. It exists and can deal with any subject matter that's brought before it.
So it depends on how it's vested. Now, according to the courts, I mean, this was the dangerous of what Democrats did. It used to be the case that the committee was limited by the committee's internal jurisdiction, and that was limited by the vote of the whole House authorizing what they could look at, who could be on it, ranking members were chosen in a certain way, so on and so forth. However, Democrats have eviscerated all that, all for their little January 6th show hearings. They eviscerated all those limitations. Now there's none. There's none. The courts were eager to let the January 6th committee run rampant. Okay, if those are the new rules, we get to do the same thing. That means if we don't want Democrats on the committee, fine. No Democrats are on the committee. Or our hand-picked 4 or 5 Democrats that we like. Or we just don't put them on the committee. We're not limited by the jurisdiction of what's put into the original order. We don't have to have the committee chairman sign off. These are the new rules that Democrats set and the D.C. courts, pro-establishment courts set. Now, we'll see if they suddenly change and so, well, now that we think about it, now that you're looking at the CIA, because courts are notoriously wusses when it comes to dealing with the powerful interest in American society, sadly. So we'll see. But theoretically, there's no limits based on that precedent. Typically, before the January 6th committee process, it's limited by the jurisdiction that is established by the committee, so by the full House. Now, my understanding is what the authority is going to be is to look into the entire. It's broad. What the church committee was a select committee on intelligence before there was any committee on intelligence to look at the entire intelligence community in the United States. This is supposed to be even broader. Is to look at everything. It was like a combination of the church committee and the House committee on assassinations. And it's combining the two and looking at all of the weaponized politicization and partisan use and misuse and abuse of lawfare in America by the Justice Department, by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, by the IRS, by the Department of Homeland Security, by the Central Intelligence Agency, by the National Security Agency, everything and everybody. We'll see if they keep their word on it. But if they do, it will be the most powerful committee, arguably, in the history of the country.
Second question, and actually someone had asked it, and I feel smarter for having thought of it. Will single-member amendments be used as a weapon for Democrats to tie things up on the floor when legislation is voted on? Like, if anybody can...
Oh, that's good to me. Well, let everybody propose amendments. Let people... That's what the legislative process is supposed to be about. It's not supposed to be a few people at the top, meet with some lobbyists, and cram down the vote on everybody else. That's not what it was ever supposed to be. Why do we have 435 representatives if only 15 get to make decisions? And that's what Chip Roy's point was. He's like, look, the whole country increasingly doubts whether left or right, whether our system works. When people see debate, like what they saw over the last week, that's a good thing. That's what we should see. We should see honest debate, honest dialogue, honest discussion, open multiple member participation where the American people can participate at some level. That was the most interesting House vote any American has ever personally witnessed because nobody witnessed the 1921 or the 1856. Yeah, exactly. I mean, outside of the people that were in the gallery, for people that don't know, we've gone months without a speaker. So, we've gone hundreds of votes without speakers.
Let me ask that. That was the next question. Like in 1856, when it went 114 or whatever votes.
3 months, 4 months, something like that.
So what happens? Like, first of all, what are the actual powers?
Let's say, nobody's going to be crying that the House can't vote, right? Whenever the government shuts down, they always say the world's going to fall apart, and then the world never falls apart. It's like, let's shut it down for a little while. So see how it works. So it works for a month, 2 months, a couple of months. Hey, you know what? It works better. The world looks better when the government can't work. When no bureaucrat can get into their office, everybody's better off.
Robert, it might be very analogous to Twitter. Cut 75% of the workforce, and it still runs good and maybe even better.
It's more productive.
So the Speaker of the House, do they actually have concrete powers that are important, or is it a figurehead?
Oh no, they have concrete powers, a lot of concrete powers. Yep.
Okay.
So appointments to committees, a whole bunch of things. But effectively, what this did is re-democratize a lot of that power, so that his power is less distilled in him as an individual.
I know that you don't think much of the WEF things, but there's a page on the WEF for McCarthy. He attended the conference, from what I understand, in 2018. Does he represent globalist interests?
I mean, he's a schmuck. I mean, that's the best way to understand him. He's a guy that go with the wind, right? I mean, this guy's not like McConnell. He has a truly defined agenda, some of which on the judicial and legal side, as Mike Davis pointed out, shared a lot. Conservatives had a lot to share in common with that. But the other part of McConnell's agenda was very much a corporatist globalist agenda. And there he was a great harm. But he believes it. I don't think anybody believes Kevin McCarthy really believes anything. I mean, that's the truth. Kevin McCarthy believes in Kevin McCarthy. And he wants to get promoted. And he loves having the little gavel. That's who Kevin McCarthy is. That's why he's not, like, when people were saying, well, just keep voting no. I'm like, well, there needs to be an exit plan here. I mean, I get maybe just shut down the House for the 2 years, see what happens, see how the government reacts. Okay, you can play that angle, but that's what you're playing because there wasn't an alternative. The core problem is the Republican caucus has a minority of populists in it. Steve Scalise probably would have been worse than McCarthy. You can make different arguments about some of the other names. I had proposed Trump, as a temporary solution. And that's where it was going to go if McCarthy didn't fold. And it was useful. Trump played this well. I mean, without getting into too much details, what was publicly seen is that Trump put McCarthy over the top. What may have been privately the case is that Trump was leveraging it and telling McCarthy that if he didn't concede on a bunch of the concessions being demanded, that he would replace him instead. And so McCarthy folded pretty quick. Within 3 days, and that's a sign also who McCarthy is. But he folded on things that, again, have not been done in the modern era of the House of Representatives, giving real power to not only the Freedom Caucus, but more importantly to the individual House member. And calling, again, for a committee that's only been formed once in American history. That you could argue the War Racketeering Committee is very similar, or 1930s, run by the great Senator Gerald Nye out of North Dakota. That's where we got all the war racketeering information and about how war is a racket. And, Smedley Butler, all the investigative files came out in that committee. Fantastic research they did. They showed who was making money off of World War I, who was trying to make money off of getting into World War II. I mean, all that was fantastic. Those are probably the two greatest committees in the history of the House of Representatives. And this has the potential to be the third greatest, and maybe the greatest of all three if it really is powerful. So that I'm hopeful that that's where it goes. And I think that was a smarter strategy than let's try to shut down the House for 2 years.